Hello everyone and welcome to my patch 14.14 tier list. In this video, I'm just going to talk about what I think is strongest in the game right now. I'm not aiming at any specific elo. I will make a separate video specifically for low elos, but I just think this one is overall what I think is strongest. As always, you can hit Challenger with any champion on this list. In fact, even some of the champs in D tier I think have Challenger 1 tricks, so don't be discouraged if your champ is super low. I will talk through the reasonings just in general for the meta and why I think certain champs are in the places that they are. So let's talk about the meta right now. I'll go into more detail in a moment, but basically there are two main ways to win the game as a mid laner right now. You can either play an AD mid that gets priority, so a lot of the AD carries. This works especially well with AP junglers, or you can play an AP mid that has very good CC or very good 2v2 potential, and you combine that with an AD ganking jungler and you just try play for fights. So let's kind of go a bit more in detail into those. So we'll start with the ADC mid meta. So why are ADC mids meta to begin with? Well, first off, they're really good with the AP junglers, right? The AP junglers are quite strong at the moment, and a lot of them really benefit from having mid prior, right? Champs like Lilia or Nidalee really want to skirmish in River. They want to be able to take away camps. They want to play for those neutral objectives, and so having mid prior for that is really, really useful. And AD mids, especially AD carry mids, are really, really good at getting mid prior because they don't really have any cooldowns, right? Because they have auto attacks. They also don't really have any costs, like resource costs. They don't use a whole lot of mana. And with the addition of Absorb Life plus Fleet still being so strong, they have both the ability to dodge a lot of skill shots as well as sustain any damage that they do take. So basically, they're just prior generating machines, and they're very, very hard to beat 1v1, even if their 2v2 is a bit weaker. And they're kind of relying on being so strong 1v1 that they can make it so that it's never a 2v2, and instead it's just a 2v1. Also, AD mids, or AD carry mids specifically, are very, very good at scaling, right? The ADC itemization right now is very, very strong, so pretty much any AD carry will outscale mages. Not completely, but like they will scale. The typical mage will get outscaled by the typical crit AD carry for the most part. And also another thing is that it's much easier to stack multiple ADs on a team than it is to be multiple AP. I've talked about this a lot, but AP itemization is very, very weak, especially if you have multiple APs on a team. I think the ideal damage balance is to have 4 AD champs and 1 AP champ. I really do think that having even 2 AP champs it's not unplayable, especially if you're playing utility champs, but it's really bad. I think that ideally you just only have 1 AP champ per team, so that's another reason why AD mids are quite strong. Now, which ones are good? So I'll talk about the champs specifically, but I think Zeri, Lucian, and Ezreal are all very good. I think that Akshan is pretty solid. Corki, I think, is not so good in solo queue. He has a very, very strong laning phase, but he's like kind of weak at skirmishing compared to the others and takes a while to spike. I think Kaisa is not bad. I've also seen some, honestly, I've seen like pretty much every AD carry played mid. I didn't put them all on the list, but I've seen like Callista and Sivir both played into Corki. I've seen Caitlyn played. I've seen Draven played into Lucian and Tristana. So pretty much, I think just about any AD carry that you can play mid, if you can get a winning matchup with it, it can probably work. So things like Varus or like Vayne counterpick, maybe even Xayah, like I honestly think there is potential for all of them. The main thing just being you need to be able to get priority over mid. That's what you're playing for. I'll quickly say that Tristana feels like she's pretty much out of meta right now. I'll maybe talk about her a bit more later, but yeah, I think she's kind of gone. So for the AP mids, the kind of AP way of winning the game is to play for lots of river fights. Most AP champs aren't going to be able to generate prior 1v1 over champs like Zeri, Lucian, and Ezreal. There are some exceptions to that, but they're generally going to have to play for 2v2 instead. So that means having a lot of CC or having a very strong teamfight presence in order to make up for the fact that you're not generating your prior 1v1. So probably the best champ in the game right now is LeBlanc. Again, I'll talk a bit more about her later, but obviously, LeBlanc has a lot of CC. Stuff like Syndra and Ahri are very good. Syndra actually has quite good matchups into a lot of the AD carries. Hwei also is very good against ADCs. Taliyah does well against a lot of the kind of meta champs, right? Like there's a lot of melees being played. And again, I'll talk about these all in more detail, but like all these champs here like have a lot of 2v2 ability, and champs like Cassiopeia and Ori have pretty good lanes. I will go, again, more in depth into Aurora, but I think Aurora kind of fits that as well. She's like a really, really good 2v2 champ, and I think pretty strong at the moment. So let's go through all the champs specifically, and we'll start with LeBlanc. So I think LeBlanc is overall probably the best AP blind at the moment. So the thing with LeBlanc is there's pros and cons. So LeBlanc is very, very good with the strong AD junglers, and she's also very, very good with the supports. So if you're playing LeBlanc with something like Rek'Sai or Xin Zhao or Lee Sin and a support like Rel or Nautilus or Leona, it's really, really good. Now, LeBlanc in isolation is definitely not that good, right? Like, if you're playing LeBlanc in isolation and you end up against something like Lucian, you're going to be pushed in, and it's going to be hard for you to really find an opportunity to find impact. So, in that sense, while it is a blind pick matchup-wise, you kind of need to have seen at least probably your jungle or support pick before you lock it in. Obviously, if you see a good mid matchup for it, you can go for it. But I do think, yeah, LeBlanc gets banned a lot in my games, but she is really, really good if you can get a good game for her. And to be honest, most of the time, if you pick LeBlanc, I think at the moment you will end up with a melee support anyway. And unless your jungler is really set on playing AP, which hopefully they will hover that, most likely you will get an AD ganking jungler. Next is Zeri. So Zeri, I think, gets a lot of prio over mid and also scales very, very well. And actually her skirmishing is not too bad either. So Zeri is, again, like a very solid, just blind pick in general. The nice thing as well is that Zeri is very much a flex pick, right? Like, if you lock in Zeri, you know, sometimes there are flex picks where it's like, okay, this can be played in another lane, but, like, realistically, it's going mid. And Lucian's an example of that. Zeri, though, is played bot lane all the time. And so if you lock in Zeri mid, it's definitely not guaranteed for the enemy team that it's going to be Zeri, right? They can't just immediately pick a champion like, okay, it's Zeri mid. So that's really, really nice to have that flexibility. Lucian, I think, is really, really strong in lane, but is somewhat vulnerable to being counterpicked. So one thing that's a bit different about Lucian is that he's not a good fleet user. And fleet is really, really useful for playing against champs like Syndra. So Syndra is quite good against like the AD carries, but the ones that have fleet tend to do quite well into it because that extra sustain and move speed can be really good. Whereas I think PTA Lucian is just not as good, and also the Lucian trading pattern can kind of struggle against Syndra. So Lucian is, I mean, it's really good against LeBlanc. It's also really good against champs like Corki. So you can play it into a lot of the other AD carries. I think it's still a decent blind and overall pretty strong. Like, it scales pretty well as well. But it's perhaps a bit riskier to pick. I think Ezreal is, again, another kind of true flex pick. It gets played bot lane at the moment a lot. Ezreal is also quite good against a lot of the mid matchups. So the ones that are playing for that 2v2, you know, stuff like Aurora or LeBlanc, you know, Ezreal is very hard to gank and also has, like, honestly, a lot of wave clear just because he pushes so fast. I guess it's not so much wave clear, but he has a lot of push, and it's very hard to contest. I think Ezreal also specifically is quite good against Aurora just because you can E out of her ulti. So yeah, these champs are all quite strong, I would say, up here in the S tier. Then I think the gap between S tier and A tier isn't huge, but I think there's still like a noticeable difference, right? So coming down to the A tier, let's talk a bit about Aurora. So I think Aurora is pretty decent in lane. She's not amazing. She is going to lose to other lane bullies like Orianna or Syndra. But she has really, really good gank setup. I think her ulti is extremely strong, and she's also very, very difficult to gank, with all her safety. I think the best runes and items, I think for items, Malignance feels like the best. I think ulti CDR is really, really important on this champ, and then you can go Malignance into like some form of burst, right? You can go like Malignance Shadow Flame, you can go Malignance Deathcap, you can also go Malignance Leandria if you want a bit more DPS. Malignance Zonya is an option. As for the runes, I think Fleet or Electrocute are both options. The nice thing about Electrocute is, honestly, mainly that you get Ultimate Hunter. And I think, again, having your ult up all the time in this champ is super nice. I feel like Electrocute itself, if you're in a lane that you can proc it easily, like especially shorter range matchups or ones that the damage really sticks, like they don't have a lot of sustain, then it's very, very good. I think against some of the harder matchups, though, you probably should be thinking about Fleet instead. Next one is Yone. So Yone is probably your best counter to some of the if APs get picked, Yone is one of the best because most of the APs can't really kill Yone at all. And depending on how much CC they have, you know, Yone can be very, very good or very bad. Like, Yone is quite good against Syndra. Yone is quite good against, like, Ori, for example. Also quite good against Ahri. But it's not that great against champs like Vex or Annie or Lissandra. Against the AD carry matchups, you do lose prior to them early, but you do very, very well into them into the side lane. So it kind of depends. Like, if the game blows up early, then it honestly ends up sucking. But if the game is stable for the first 10 minutes or so, then it can be a really, really good pick. So I might have him a bit too high on this list. Potentially could put him lower. It kind of depends if you're using Yone as a counter pick or if you're picking him all the time. I think if you are picking him all the time, I'd put him quite a bit lower. But as a counter pick, I think he's really good. Then Syndra. So Syndra is pretty good at the moment. She has favorable matchups into a lot of the meta champs. So Syndra is very good against Hwei, very good against Taliyah, pretty good against like Vex, Lissandra, Annie. Syndra also is good against Akshan. It's good against Aurora. It's good against Lucian. I think it's okay against Zeri. So like she has a lot of very good matchups. Also, like, she has very, very good gank setup and very, very good skirmishing. So there's a lot of like win conditions for her to play to. And I think again a great counter, potentially even a blind, because a lot of the champs that you counter Syndra with are on the weaker side. So like you have Yone, but like you still get a window to impact the game. Champs like I think like a Kali and Zed are even after buffs like still a little on the weak side. So not super strong. And I think yeah, actually underrated as a blind, although she is very gankable, right? Like if you blind Syndra and you end up against again LeBlanc, Liss, and Rel, it's gonna be a really rough game. So it's kind of like blindable matchup wise, but can be difficult like team comp wise. Ahri, I think, is kind of good and kind of bad. So the problem with Ahri is that she does lose prio into like a lot of the champs. Like it's very, very hard for Ahri to get prio into any sort of AD carry mid. It's also quite hard for Ahri to get priority into a lot of the mages. That being said, Ahri's gank setup is very, very good. And I think Ahri is a good champ to think about if you either can't play LeBlanc or if LeBlanc is banned. Because at that point, your matchups are going to overall be a little bit better. And if you're still wanting to play towards that kind of 2v2 win condition, that's definitely a way to do it. Next is Hwei. So Hwei again has pretty good matchups. Hwei is quite good against the AD carry mids because it's very difficult for them to dash into him because he can always EQ them away. And also he has very good wave clear after his first base in order to just neutralize the waves. Now, the problem with Hwei is that against especially the fleet users, his poke doesn't stick that well. And also Hwei honestly is just outscaled by the crit AD carries, I would say. So I think like if you're playing Hwei into something like Zeri, like you're fine with that. There's nothing really wrong with it, but it like Zeri, I would say, is still happy with that too. It's not like a super hard counter pick, but it's still pretty solid. Taliyah, I think, is probably maybe even the best compositional counter pick on the patch. So Taliyah against teams with lots of short range or lots of dashes, particularly if you have set up, if you're playing Taliyah with, say, Renekton, Zinzao, Leona, you're going to have an absolute field day, right? So I think Taliyah is extremely strong. The only downside of Taliyah is that she has some very rough matchups. Taliyah into Ori, Syndra, LeBlanc is really hard. I think even Taliyah versus Aurora is not that good. The AD carries, you kind of have to give priority early. You kind of just have to sit under your turret for the first, pretty much till first base. And then once you get the mana to actually contest, you can push out. But it can be annoying. Let's say you pick Taliyah into something like Lucian. Even if you can get prior later, potentially the game can kind of like explode a bit too much before you kind of get to that point. So after that, I kind of have a bunch of champs that I've actually moved a lot higher since last time. So I think, again, just because the other way to win the game, other than playing the AD mids, is to play for that, 2v2. These champs, such as Vex, Annie, Lissandra, and Galio, are extremely good in those skirmishes in River. So even though that they're more likely to lose prior to these champs, you can play for that win condition really well. I will say that Galio is probably the weakest blind of them, in the sense that if you play Galio against an AD carry mid, good luck, you're probably never leaving your turret. But I think the rest are they're okay blinds. I think they have a combination of threat plus decent laning phases, which actually will do enough. So definitely champs you can think about if you don't want to play kind of this upper echelon of champs here. Akshan, I think Akshan is kind of a cheese pick, to be honest. It's a champ that needs the snowball to do well, and I think it can very easily be that you pick Akshan, don't get anything done, and just quickly become useless. That being said, I think with how fast-paced solo queue games are, Akshan has plenty of opportunities just to randomly get fed. He's kind of Katarina if she had a really strong laning phase. So I think in that sense, Akshan is quite valuable. Then the last couple champs I have in A tier is Cassio. So Cassio actually has pretty good matchups into the AD carries, not into all of them though. So Cassio is quite good against Lucian. It's also quite good against Zeri. It's not particularly good against some of the longer range ones. So something like Ezreal or Kai'Sa can end up just outranging you too much in mid game. But that's definitely an option. Cassio is also quite good if your opponent does blind something a little suspicious, like Yone, for example. Or if they blind even a Galio or an Akshan, those are all champs that can be countered by Cassio. And Cassio's skirmishing is actually still quite good. She just does a lot of damage. That's quite useful as well because a lot of those kind of AP junglers, AD mids, they want sustained fights, right? They don't have a lot of burst normally. And so having a sustained DPS champ to fight that is very, very nice. Finally, in A tier, we have Orianna. So Orianna is mainly... okay, I would say Ori is very... She has a very narrow window to win the game right now. I do think she is strong, but she doesn't scale insanely well, and also she's not that good at skirmishing. But what she does have is this insane laning phase, and I think in lane, I've seen a lot of Oriannas picked into champs like Taliyah or Aurora or Zeri's another one, and just absolutely destroying the lane and preventing those champs from ever like finding a way into the game. That being said, if you were playing Ori kind of just like as a, you're not going to pressure your lane that hard and you want to just play for 2v2 and outscale, you're much better off playing Syndra, I think. And so like, in my opinion, Ori, even though she's strong, she is just, yeah, I mean, she's good, right? Like she is in A tier, but I think it's just, you really need to take advantage of that very specific strength and that narrow window that Ori does have over those other champs in order to really, I guess, like leverage her strengths. Otherwise, you're better off playing a different champ. Now, I won't go through all the B, C, and D tier champs specifically, but I will talk about the categories as a whole. So B tier champs, a lot of them are quite good in either skirmish or in lane, but they're kind of just like a little weaker than others. So like a champ like Zoe is kind of just like not, even though she's like got really high snowball potential, it can be very difficult if you're just getting pushed in by one of these stronger laners. Champs like Azir or Corki tend to just be a bit too weak in early skirmishes, even though they're very, very strong in straight up fights. And then, a lot of the other champs on this list, you've got some champs that are amazing 2v2, stuff like Kiana. But like if you're playing an AD mid, you might as well be playing one that gets prior the whole time, right? So again, these champs are honestly like none of them are really bad, and a lot of them do actually have like good counter picks, right? Like if you pick Sylas into Ahri, and they've also got like Alistar or something that's really good. Like TF with ganking junglers, Yasuo with into AD carries plus ganking stuff, or like Diana maybe, and then you've got like other niche counter picks in here like Ziggs into certain champs. I think Lux works well into some AD carries, like Renekton into melees, especially with Taliyah jungle. So there's like lots of options here for situational picks, but overall, especially if you're looking for something to play every game, it's probably better to play one of these. But at the same time, like these are strong. Once we're getting towards like the C tier, we're kind of getting to champs that like don't have a super big strength in the meta. So like a champ like Ryze, it's like, okay, well, this champ doesn't scale that well. It's kind of hard to get prior in some of the like AD carry matchups. And also like, even though Ryze ganks it up and roaming is quite good, it's like, is it really better than some of the other champs up here? Like, honestly, not really. And it's kind of the same with a lot of these champs. Like, they do have some win conditions, right? Like, again, like good ganks up and scaling from Mal's, good gang setup from Veigar, but it's like, okay, well, we've got other champs that do that better. So I think I see the C tier as champs that are honestly not weak. Like, I think, again, like these champs all have some niche situations and like they're definitely not awful. But they typically offer less than the champs that are up here. Finally, D tier. I mean, these are the only champs that I would specifically try and stay away from playing. So like these champs, well, like Kassadin and Vlad and Kayle offer no lane prior pretty much, and also no gang setup, and also no 2v2 potential. So really what you're playing for is like, oh, maybe Kayle, Vlad on like specific windows have 2v2 potential and like they do scale, but I think you're really relying on your opponents to like not close out the game or to just like not really pressure you. So I think like as you get higher elo, they'll become more difficult, but honestly they might be stronger in lower elos. And again, I'll make a lower elo tier list talking about that. So yeah, these champs I would just stay away from for the most part. But I think anything C and above, I would highly recommend playing. Obviously, if you can play the champs at the top of the list, that is better. I guess one thing worth mentioning is that a lot of the way mid works right now is it's very dependent on what your jungler picks. So like if you're playing, for example, an AD carry mid with like an AD jungler like Liss, is it okay? Like, yeah, but like I wouldn't consider like a Zeri with Liss S tier at all, right? Like Zeri would be S tier specifically because she's getting prior with an AP jungler. So kind of remember that like mid jungle is definitely a 2v2 and a lot of the time a 3v3 with the support as well. And so really try not to pick champs in isolation. And if you can, try pick after your jungler, or even ask your jungler if they're playing AD or AP. That can make a really big difference. So I think that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions or anything, please leave them in the comment section below. I will try to get to all of them. Otherwise, come check out my stream on twitch.tv/shoklol. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next tier list, probably tomorrow.